Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
"Give me the medical proxy," Beatrice Vance snapped, her voice cutting through the polite hum of the charity gala like a scalpel. She didn't wait for an answer, her hand outstretched, palm up, as if she were demanding a valet ticket rather than total control over her granddaughter's life. "You clearly don't have the temperament to manage Maya's care, and quite frankly, Elena, you look like you haven't slept in a week. It's embarrassing for the family." Elena Vance stood her ground in the shadow of a towering floral arrangement. The scent of lilies was cloying, thick enough to choke the air in the St. Regis ballroom. She looked at the woman across from her, the matriarch of the Vance Empire, draped in emerald silk and wearing a necklace that cost more than the pediatric wing Elena managed. Beatrice didn't see a daughter-in-law or a skilled surgeon. She saw an obstacle to be cleared. "Maya is recovering well from the procedure, Beatrice," Elena said, her voice a low, steady contrast to the older woman's sharp edge. "As her mother and her doctor, I'm exactly where I need to be." Beatrice let out a short, mocking laugh that drew the attention of a nearby group of donors. "A doctor? You're a glorified technician who spends more time in scrubs than in a salon. Look at you." She gestured dismissively at Elena's off-the-rack navy dress. The fabric felt scratchy against Elena's skin, a stark contrast to the buttery silk Beatrice favored. "You're polluting the Vance name by appearing in public looking like a tired nurse. People are whispering, Elena. They wonder why the widow of my son is so diminished." A few feet away, Cassian Vance leaned against a marble pillar, swirling a glass of amber bourbon. He offered Elena a slow, shark-like grin. He was the golden boy, the favored son whose gambling debts were a family secret Elena had only recently begun to piece together. "Mother's right, Elena," he chimed in, his voice oily. "You're exhausted. Let us take the burden of Maya's trust and her medical decisions. You can go back to your little clinic and play hero, without the stress of actual responsibility." Elena felt the familiar heat of indignation rising in her chest, but she didn't let it reach her face. Years in the operating room had taught her the value of a steady hand and a masked expression. She reached into her small, beaded clutch, her fingers brushing against the cool, rectangular weight of her smartphone. She felt the haptic vibration as she double-tapped the side button, a preset shortcut. The recording was active. "The trust is Maya's inheritance," Elena said calmly. "And her medical decisions are mine. I won't be signing anything tonight or ever." Beatrice stepped closer, invading Elena's personal space. The cloying scent of Chanel No. 5 hit Elena like a physical blow. "Listen to me, you ungrateful girl. I built this legacy. I will not have it squandered by a woman who thinks a medical degree gives her the right to defy me. If you don't hand over that proxy by Monday, I'll make sure the board hears about your instability. I'll have Maya moved to a facility where you'll need a pass just to see her." The threat was a physical weight in the room. Elena looked around. To the elite guests sipping vintage champagne, this looked like a quiet family conversation. They didn't see the wolf baring its teeth. They didn't see Cassian checking his platinum watch, likely calculating how much of Maya's inheritance he could siphon off to cover his latest losses at the high-stakes tables. "Is that a threat, Beatrice?" Elena asked, her voice barely a whisper. "It's a fact," the older woman sneered, leaning in so close Elena could see the fine lines of fury around her eyes. "You are a guest in this family, Elena, a temporary fixture. Don't forget who owns the roof over your head and the hospital where you work. You are nothing without the Vance name, and I can take it back whenever I wish." Beatrice turned on her heel, her silk train snapping like a whip. Cassian followed her, pausing only to wink at Elena before disappearing into the crowd of socialites. Elena stood alone for a moment, the sound of the string quartet feeling suddenly discordant. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her mind was already beginning to categorize the interaction. Threat of custodial interference, admission of professional sabotage, financial coercion. She was methodical by nature. It was what made her the best surgeon in the city. She moved toward the exit, passing a mirror in the foyer. Beatrice was right about one thing: Elena did look tired. But beneath the exhaustion was a cold, hard clarity she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't just a grieving widow or a harried mother anymore. She was a woman who had spent a decade cutting out cancers. She knew how to handle a malignancy. As she reached the valet, she pulled out her phone and hit stop on the recording. She immediately forwarded the file to a contact labeled Arthur Sterling. "Arthur," she said when the lawyer picked up on the second ring. "It started. She went for the proxy in public. Did you get it?" Arthur's voice was gravelly, seasoned by decades of Vance family secrets. "Every word," Elena replied, watching as her modest sedan was brought around, looking like a toy among the rows of Ferraris and Bentleys. "She thinks I'm a tired nurse she can bully into submission. And what are you, Elena?" Elena gripped the steering wheel, the leather cool under her palms. She looked back at the glowing lights of the St. Regis, where the Vances were still celebrating their perceived power. "I'm the person who's going to make her regret ever mentioning my daughter's name," she said. She put the car in gear and drove away from the glitter and the lies. The countdown had begun. She had 48 hours before the Monday deadline Beatrice had set, and Elena Vance intended to use every second of it to ensure that when the face slap finally came, the entire city would feel the sting. The next morning, the fluorescent lights of the pediatric surgical wing hummed with a clinical indifference that Elena Vance usually found comforting. She had been in the hospital since 5, finding solace in the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the predictable scent of antiseptic. Here, she was a goddess of precision, a woman whose hands saved lives. But the peace shattered at 8 o'clock when the heavy double doors swung open, admitting a heavy cloud of expensive tuberose perfume that had no business being in a sterile environment. Beatrice Vance marched down the hallway as if she owned the foundation, her designer heels clicking against the linoleum like a metronome of impending doom. Trailing behind her, looking pale and twitchy in a $1,000 linen suit, was Cassian Vance. He couldn't even meet the gaze of the nurses he passed, his eyes darting toward the exits. "This is a restricted area," Elena said, her voice low and steady as she stepped away from a patient's chart. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The authority of the white coat was her armor. "Everything is accessible for a price, dear," Beatrice replied, her lip curling as she scanned the modest nurse's station. She pulled a leather-bound portfolio from her crocodile skin bag and dropped it onto the counter. The heavy thud echoed through the quiet ward. "I've had my lawyers draft the voluntary relinquishment. You'll sign it, and in return, I won't have the board look into your professional conduct regarding the Vance family legacy." Elena felt a surge of heat crawl up her neck, but she kept her hands flat on the cool laminate of the desk. "My professional conduct is impeccable. You, however, are trespassing." "Am I?" Beatrice stepped closer, the gold charms on her bracelet clinking with a sharp, metallic rhythm. "A girl like Maya deserves a Vance education, a Vance pedigree. She doesn't belong in a drafty apartment eating cereal while her mother plays hero for the indigent. You're holding her back, Elena. Your pride is a form of child abuse." The insult hit like a physical blow. Beside his mother, Cassian shifted his weight, his fingers plucking nervously at his cufflink. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in 48 hours, his skin sallow under the harsh lights. "Is that what you told the bookies in Macau, Cassian?" Elena asked, her eyes shifting to him. "That you were just looking out for the family legacy?" The younger man flinched, his face draining of what little color it had left. Beatrice's expression didn't change, but her eyes narrowed into predatory slits. "Don't try to deflect. You have until Monday morning to sign those papers. If you don't, I will ensure this hospital finds a reason to revoke your residency. I've already spoken to the chief of staff. He's an old friend of your late father-in-law. You're threatening my career to steal my daughter." Elena's voice was a whisper now, dangerous and sharp. "I'm saving my granddaughter from a life of mediocrity," Beatrice snapped. She leaned in, her breath smelling of peppermint and cold ambition. "Look at you. You're exhausted. You're small. You're nothing without our name. Sign the papers, take the settlement, and go back to whatever hole you crawled out of before you met my son." Elena reached out, her fingers brushing the leather of the portfolio. For a second, Beatrice smirked, thinking she had won. But Elena didn't open it. Instead, she slid it back across the counter with a slow, deliberate motion. "Monday," Elena said, her gaze locking onto Beatrice's. "I'll see you then. But I wouldn't get too comfortable in that corner office, Beatrice. The foundations are rot dry." Beatrice scoffed, snatching the portfolio back. "Enjoy your last weekend of relevance, Elena Vance. It's the only one you have left." She turned on her heel, her son following like a scolded dog. Elena watched them go, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. As soon as the elevator doors hissed shut, her phone vibrated in her pocket. It was a message from Arthur Sterling. There were no words, only a high-resolution photograph of a yellowed, dusty ledger page. It was an old internal audit from the Vance family's private holdings, dated 3 years ago. At the bottom of the page, a series of unauthorized transfers were highlighted in red, all flowing into a shell company registered in Cashin's name. Elena's thumb hovered over the screen. The face slap wasn't just coming. She was currently holding the hand that would deliver it. Beatrice thought she was fighting for a child, but Elena was about to show her that she was actually fighting for her life. She looked at the clock. 39 hours until Monday. "Not long now," she whispered to the empty hallway, the scent of tuberose finally fading beneath the clean, sharp smell of the coming storm. The following morning, the sun rose with a deceptive, pale warmth that did little to cut through the chill lingering in Elena's bones. She met Arthur Sterling in the dim, wood-paneled quiet of his private study, a space that smelled of aged leather and the sharp, acidic tang of cold espresso. The lawyer didn't waste time with pleasantries. He tapped the physical copy of the ledger page Elena had seen on her phone the night before, his expression as grim as a tombstone. "It's worse than the audit suggested," Arthur said, his voice a low rasp. "Cashin hasn't just been skimming. He's been gutting the primary trust to cover high-stakes gambling debts in Macau. And Beatrice, she's been signing off on the administrative fees that mask the transfers. If the board sees this, it's not just a scandal. It's a criminal indictment for embezzlement." Elena Vance ran her fingers over the grain of the heavy mahogany desk. She felt a strange, cold clarity. For years, she had been the outsider, the woman who wasn't Vance enough for their gilded world. Now she held the thread that could unravel their entire tapestry. "Can they link it to me?" she asked. "If I bring this forward, will they claim I was complicit because of my marriage?" "Not a chance," Arthur replied, sliding a second folder toward her. "I've secured the internal memos. Beatrice Vance went to great lengths to keep you out of the family's financial loop. Her own arrogance is your best defense. She thought you were too small to matter, so she never bothered to hide her tracks from you, only from the IRS." Elena took the folder, the heavy bond paper feeling like a whetted blade in her hands. She had 36 hours left. By noon, she was back at the Vance estate for the mandatory Sunday brunch, a tradition that always felt more like a court summons than a meal. The dining room was an oppressive display of wealth, the air thick with the cloying scent of lilies and the metallic undertone of silver polish. Beatrice sat at the head of the table, draped in silk the color of a bruised plum, her eyes tracking Elena's every movement with predatory stillness. "You're late, Elena," Beatrice said, the sound of her silver spoon clinking against fine bone china echoing like a gavel. "I suppose the hospital doesn't teach its staff the value of a family's time." "A child had a ruptured appendix, Beatrice," Elena replied, taking her seat. She kept her voice level, her hands steady as she unfolded her linen napkin. "Time has a different value when lives are on the line." Cashin Vance sat across from her, his face slightly flushed, likely from a mid-morning scotch. He adjusted his gold watch, a Patek Philippe that Elena now knew was paid for by the stolen inheritance of his own nieces and nephews. He smirked at her, his eyes glassy with unearned confidence. "Always so dramatic, Elena," he drawled. "Mother is right. You spend so much time in those sterile halls you've forgotten how to behave in polite society. It's exactly why we've decided that Maya needs a more structured environment." Elena's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't let her expression flicker. "Structured?" Beatrice leaned forward, her diamonds catching the light. "We've already begun the paperwork for the Institut La Rosie in Switzerland. Maya will start in the fall. A surgeon's schedule is no place for a Vance heir, and frankly, your influence is making her soft. She needs to understand her station. The audacity of the statement hit Elena like a physical blow. They weren't just stealing money. They were stealing her daughter's childhood to maintain their grip on a legacy built on fraud. She looked at Beatrice, seeing the woman's utter certainty that she had already won. To Beatrice, Elena was nothing more than a temporary inconvenience, a stray they had allowed into the house who was finally being shown the door. "Maya is 9, Elena said, her voice dropping an octave. "She belongs with her mother." "She belongs to the name," Beatrice snapped, her facade of elegance slipping for a fraction of a second to reveal the iron-fisted tyrant beneath. "And since you clearly can't afford the life she deserves on a doctor's pittance, the family is stepping in. Don't make this difficult, dear. You've already lost." Cashin chuckled, reaching for the crystal carafe of orange juice. "Think of it as a relief, Elena. You can go back to your little clinic and play hero without a child slowing you down. We'll even let you visit on holidays, if you're on your best behavior." Elena felt the manila envelope in her bag, tucked beneath her chair. The weight of it was a comfort now. She looked at Cashin, then at the woman who had spent a decade trying to break her spirit. She didn't feel the familiar surge of panic or the urge to plead. Instead, she felt a dark, shimmering sense of anticipation. "You're right, Beatrice," Elena said, a small, terrifyingly calm smile touching her lips. "I suppose I should stop fighting the inevitable. Family reputation is everything, isn't it?" Beatrice's eyes narrowed, searching Elena's face for a sign of weakness, but finding only a chilling composure. "I'm glad you finally found some sense. We'll discuss the transfer of custody after the Foundation Gala tomorrow night. It will be a perfect time to announce Maya's new path." "Tomorrow night," Elena repeated, her mind racing through the final steps of Arthur's plan. "I wouldn't miss it for the world. It's going to be a night no one forgets." As she stood to leave, she caught Cashin's gaze. He was still smiling, the smile of a man who thought he was the hunter. He had no idea that the face slap was already in motion. He didn't know that by this time tomorrow, the very name he used as a shield would be the weight that pulled him under. Elena walked out of the dining room, her heels clicking a rhythmic, lethal beat against the marble floor. She didn't look back at the house that had been her prison. She had 28 hours. The storm wasn't just coming. She was the one who had opened the gates. She pulled out her phone and sent a 3-word text to Arthur Sterling. "The fuse is lit." By 2 o'clock the following afternoon, the Vance estate had been transformed into a staging ground for the Foundation Gala. The air in the solarium was thick with the cloying, sweet scent of white lilies, hundreds of them, arranged in towering crystal vases that caught the midday sun. Elena stood by the glass wall, her fingers tracing the cold, textured grain of a leather portfolio she held against her side. Inside lay the bank records Arthur had finalized an hour ago. The digital trail of every cent Cashin had bled from the charity accounts to fuel his gambling debts. Beatrice didn't look up from her clipboard as she marched into the room. She was draped in a cream silk suit that shimmered with an aggressive, expensive luster, her movements sharp and predatory. She gestured toward a floral arrangement with a flick of her wrist, her diamonds flashing. "Move those to the foyer," she snapped at a trembling florist. "They look crowded here, much like you, Elena." The insult was delivered with the casual ease of a woman who had spent decades stepping on others to keep her own heels clean. Elena didn't flinch. She simply adjusted her grip on the portfolio, feeling the weight of the truth it contained. "The house is certainly crowded today," she said, her voice a low, steady contrast to the frantic energy in the room. "It's amazing how much effort goes into maintaining an image when the reality is so different." Beatrice finally turned, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. "Image is all you have when you lack substance. Tomorrow night, when we announce Maya's enrollment in the academy and her new path within the Vance legacy, people will see a family united. They won't see a mother who couldn't keep her husband's interest or a woman who thinks she can challenge me." The words were a calculated strike, designed to humiliate Elena in front of the catering staff and the decorators who were now pausing to listen. Elena watched a single bead of condensation slide down a crystal pitcher on the nearby table, silent and inevitable. She felt a strange, crystalline clarity. The rage was there, but it was controlled, channeled into the weapon she carried. "You should be careful, Beatrice," Elena said softly, her gaze never wavering. "When you build a legacy on a foundation of lies, even a small crack can bring the whole ceiling down. Are you entirely sure you've accounted for every variable before the guests arrive?" Beatrice let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the glass walls. "Variables? I own the variables. I own the bank, the board, and the very ground you're standing on. You're a guest in this house, Elena, a temporary one. Don't mistake my tolerance for weakness." "I would never dream of it," Elena replied, a small ghost of a smile touching her lips. The doors swung open, and Cashin sauntered in, smelling of expensive bourbon and unearned confidence even at midday. He didn't even look at Elena as he reached for a glass of water, his hand trembling slightly, a telltale sign of the pressure his creditors were applying. "Mother, the caterers are asking about the vintage selection. I told them to go with the 98. Only the best for our final victory, right?" He smirked at Elena then, a jagged, ugly expression. "Hope you have your bags packed." Maya Vance is already excited about her new room in the East Wing. She won't even remember your name by Christmas. The cruelty was breathtaking, but Elena merely nodded. She felt the phantom weight of the revelation she was about to deliver. It was a physical pressure in her chest, a ticking clock that only she could hear. Julian Vance and the rest of the board would be there tomorrow. They would see the 98 vintage, and they would see exactly whose inheritance had been stolen to pay for it. "Enjoy the flowers while they're fresh, Cashin," Elena said, her heels clicking a rhythmic, lethal beat against the marble as she turned to leave. "Things have a way of wilting very quickly once the lights come up." She walked out before either of them could respond, her heart hammering a steady rhythm. She had 18 hours left. The warning had been given, and as expected, it had been ignored. As she reached her car, she checked her phone. A message from Arthur Sterling was waiting. "The media list is confirmed. The projector is rigged. Sleep well, Elena. Tomorrow, the world ends for them." Elena looked back at the sprawling mansion, the sun glinting off the windows like dragon scales. She didn't need sleep. She needed the sun to go down, so the real work could begin. The evening arrived with a heavy, expectant stillness that seemed to settle over the Vance estate like a shroud. Under the amber glow of the massive crystal chandeliers, the grand ballroom had been transformed into a temple of excess. The scent of white gardenias was so thick it felt cloying, an aggressive floral perfume designed to mask the stale smell of old money and even older secrets. Elena stepped out of the black car, her heels clicking against the damp gravel. She wore a dress of midnight silk, simple and architectural, a sharp contrast to the frothy, over-designed gowns of the women already streaming through the arched mahogany doors. She felt the weight of the small, silver remote tucked into her clutch, a silent, digital detonator. Her pulse was a steady, rhythmic thrum in her ears, the heartbeat of a surgeon about to make the first incision. She hadn't been inside for more than a minute before the first wave of heat hit her. Beatrice stood at the center of a circle of board members, her neck draped in a collar of emeralds that looked like frozen drops of poison. When she spotted Elena, her eyes didn't soften, they sharpened. She excused herself from Julian Vance with a practiced, feline grace and intercepted Elena near the champagne tower. "You're late," Beatrice said, her voice a low, dangerous silk. She didn't offer a greeting. Instead, she reached out and adjusted the strap of Elena's dress with a proprietary flick of her wrist. "And I've already had the staff take Maya to the North Wing. She'll be eating with the house manager's children. Her presence at the main table would only invite questions we aren't ready to answer, especially after her outburst at the club." The air in Elena's lungs turned to ice. She thought of her daughter, tucked away in a corner of the house like an embarrassing piece of luggage, while the woman who had stolen her future stood there dripping in stolen jewels. "She's a child, Beatrice," Elena replied, her voice terrifyingly level. "Not a PR liability. In this family, there is no difference," the older woman snapped. She leaned in closer, the scent of her expensive, spicy perfume filling the space between them. Don't make a scene tonight, Elena. You're only here as a courtesy to the Vance name. Try to remember your place, or I'll ensure the medical board receives a very detailed file regarding your emotional instability following the divorce. Beatrice patted her cheek, a gesture that was more of a threat than a caress, and drifted back toward the bar. Elena stood perfectly still, her fingers tightening around the silk of her bag. She didn't look for a drink. She looked for Arthur. She found him standing near the tech alcove, a glass of sparkling water in his hand. Arthur Sterling looked every bit the distinguished lawyer, but there was a glint in his eye that hadn't been there 40 years ago. As she approached, he didn't speak. He simply adjusted his glasses and gave a single, microscopic nod toward the massive projector screen at the far end of the room. It was currently looping a tastefully muted montage of the Vance family's charitable contributions. "The server is patched," Arthur whispered as she brushed past him. "The media list is in the lobby. Once the doors are locked for the keynote, there's no stopping it." "Thank you, Arthur," she murmured. "Don't thank me yet," he said, his gaze fixed on the entrance. "Cashin is on a tier. Stay clear of him until the seating begins." Elena moved through the crowd, a ghost in the machine of high society. She watched the board members, men like Julian Vance, who had looked the other way for years while Beatrice bled the estate dry. They laughed and toasted to legacy and integrity, while sipping wine that cost more than a pediatric nurse's annual salary. She was cornered near the terrace doors by Cashin. He looked disheveled despite the bespoke tuxedo, his eyes bloodshot and his movements erratic. He held a crystal tumbler filled with amber liquid, the ice clinking violently against the glass. "There she is," Cashin sneered, blocking her path. "The grieving widow, or is it the vengeful ex-wife today? I can never keep your roles straight." "You've had too much to drink, Cashin," Elena said, trying to move around him. He stepped into her space, the smell of expensive scotch and desperation radiating off him. "I heard you were poking around the offshore filings. Let me give you some advice, Elena. Those accounts are empty. I spent the last of the inheritance on the centerpiece for tonight. Do you like the ice sculpture? It's carved from Alaskan glacial runoff. Cost a fortune." He let out a jagged, ugly laugh. "I figured if the ship was going down, we might as well have the best bubbles in the basement." "You stole from Maya," Elena said, her voice a cold, sharp blade. Cashin leaned down, his face inches from hers. "I took what was mine. The girl is a Vance in name only. You're a guest, and guests don't get to dictate how the host spends the silver." He tipped his glass toward her in a mocking salute, splashing a few drops of scotch onto the hem of her midnight dress. "Enjoy the dinner, Elena. It's the last meal you'll ever have on our dime." He stumbled away, leaving a trail of arrogance in his wake. Elena looked down at the dark spot on her dress. She didn't feel humiliated. She felt a strange, soaring sense of clarity. The chimes rang, a melodic silver sound that signaled the start of the formal program. The double doors to the dining hall swung open, revealing a table that stretched the length of the room, adorned with gold leaf and towering floral arrangements. Elena took her seat at the far end, far from the head of the table where Beatrice sat like a queen on her throne, flanked by Julian and a smug, swaying Cashin. The room went dark, save for the pinlights illuminating the gold-rimmed plates. Beatrice stood, the emeralds around her neck catching the light as she walked toward the podium. She tapped the microphone, the sound echoing through the hushed hall. "Friends, colleagues, and family," Beatrice began, her voice projecting a warmth she didn't possess. "Tonight, we celebrate the enduring legacy of the Vance name. We celebrate the future we are building for the next generation." Elena's hand went into her clutch. Her thumb found the smooth, cold surface of the remote. She looked up at the screen, where a black-and-white photo of her late husband was being displayed. "But before we begin the main course," Beatrice continued, her smile widening as she looked out over the room, "I'd like to share a special presentation on the values that define us." Elena pressed the button. The screen flickered. The image of the Vance patriarch didn't change, but a new window opened in the corner, a spreadsheet titled Unauthorized Asset Liquidation. The room remained silent for a heartbeat, the guests assuming it was a technical glitch. Beatrice didn't notice yet. she was looking at her notes. But Julian Vance did. His fork stopped halfway to his mouth, his eyes widening as the first row of numbers scrolled upward. Elena leaned back in her velvet chair, the cold weight of 5 years of silence finally lifting. She watched the blue light of the projector reflect in Beatrice's emeralds, a digital ghost finally coming home to roost. "Wait for it," Elena whispered to the empty air beside her. Beatrice turned her head toward the screen, her rehearsed smile beginning to fracture as the first bank statement, stamped with the word fraud, filled the 30-foot display. The silence in the grand ballroom was heavy, punctuated only by the low hum of the projector and the rhythmic clicking of the cooling fan. Beatrice Vance stood frozen at the podium, her hand still raised in a half-finished gesture of triumph. The emeralds at her throat caught the blue light of the fraudulent bank statements, casting sickly green shadows across her skin. Julian Vance had gone pale, his glass of vintage Bordeaux trembling so violently that the dark liquid threatened to spill onto the pristine white linen. The scent of the expensive lilies decorating the stage suddenly felt cloying, like the smell of a funeral parlor. Beatrice's face didn't just fall, it disintegrated. The carefully curated mask of the Vance matriarch, the one she had spent decades perfecting with Botox and sheer arrogance, cracked in real time. Her eyes, usually sharp and calculating, went wide and glassy, darting across the rows of numbers as if she could physically push them off the screen. A blotchy, frantic red climbed from her collarbone to her cheeks, clashing horribly with her designer rouge. Her mouth hung open, her lower lip twitching in a silent, rhythmic tremor that made her look less like a socialite and more like a landed fish gasping for air. The regal posture she prided herself on slumped, her shoulders drawing inward as her breath came in sharp, ragged hitches that whistled through her teeth. She looked small, suddenly, and desperately old. Arthur Sterling leaned forward in the front row, his silver-rimmed glasses sliding down his nose as he scrutinized the unauthorized asset liquidation header. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a predator who had finally found the scent. To his left, a prominent city councilwoman gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she whispered to her husband about criminal negligence. 2 tables back, Cassian Vance suddenly stood, his chair scraping harshly against the marble floor, a sound like a scream in the quiet room. He looked at the screen, then at his mother, his face a mask of sweating, panicked realization. The socialites who had spent the evening fawning over Beatrice now physically recoiled, their chairs shifting away from the Vance family table as if the scandal were a contagious disease. Elena stood up slowly, the silk of her dress rustling in the breathless room. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her voice was a low, steady blade that cut through the rising murmurs. "You spent years telling me I wasn't a real Vance," she said, her gaze fixed on the woman at the podium. "You said I was a parasite, an outsider who didn't understand the weight of this legacy. You treated Maya like a burden because she reminded you of a truth you couldn't control." Elena walked toward the screen, her heels clicking with a finality that sounded like a gavel. She felt the weight of the 5-year-old secret finally dissolving. "But while you were busy protecting the name, you were hollowing it out. You didn't just steal from the estate, Beatrice. You forged the signatures of a dead man to cover Cassian's gambling debts." A collective intake of breath hissed through the room. Beatrice gripped the edges of the podium, her knuckles white, her breath coming in shallow gasps. This is a fabrication," she managed to choke out, but her voice lacked its usual venom. It was thin, reedy, and desperate. "The forensic accountants don't think so," Elena replied, her tone as cold as the ice in the champagne buckets. "And neither does the district attorney's office. I've spent the last 6 months tracing every cent you moved out of Maya's trust." She turned to Arthur, who was already pulling a thick stack of legal filings from his briefcase with a practiced, lethal efficiency. "The authorities have the original digital trail, Arthur. I believe the board has seen enough to move for an immediate injunction." Elena didn't look back at the wreckage of the woman who had tried to break her daughter's spirit. She didn't need to see the socialites whispering behind their fans or the way Julian was already looking at his mother with a mixture of disgust and self-preservation. She picked up her clutch, felt the cool weight of her phone, still recording every word, and walked toward the double mahogany doors. "Wait!" Beatrice shrieked, the sound cracking as she finally found her voice. "Elena, you can't do this." "Think of the family." Elena paused at the door, her hand on the cold brass handle. She looked back one last time, her expression unreadable. "I am thinking of the family," she said quietly. "The part of it that actually matters." She stepped out into the cool night air, leaving the chaos of the ballroom behind. The war was far from over, but the crown had finally fallen. The rain had started just as Elena Vance reached the sanctuary of Arthur Sterling's downtown office, 30 minutes after the heavy mahogany doors of the gala had slammed shut behind her. The scent of old parchment and expensive floor wax filled the air, a stark contrast to the cloying lilies and desperation of the ballroom she had just escaped. She sat in a high-backed leather chair, her hands finally beginning to tremble as the adrenaline of the revelation began to ebb. "You did it, Elena," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble of approval as he set a steaming cup of tea on the mahogany desk between them. He didn't look like a man who had just helped dismantle a dynasty. He looked like a craftsman who had finally finished a long, difficult project. "The injunction is filed. The forensic audit of the Vance Foundation is already in the hands of the district attorney's office." The heavy silence of the office was shattered by the sound of the elevator chime. A moment later, the double doors burst open. Beatrice Vance charged in, her silver evening gown trailing behind her like a tattered battle flag. She was alone, her usual entourage of sycophants having vanished the moment the word fraud had been whispered in the ballroom. Julian followed a few paces behind her, his face a mask of exhausted disappointment, while a burly security guard Arthur had stationed at the door tried ineffectually to block her path. "You miserable, ungrateful girl," Beatrice shrieked, her voice cracking with a jagged edge of hysteria. She ignored Arthur entirely, her eyes locked on Elena with a predatory intensity. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You've destroyed this family. You've made us a laughingstock in every club from here to London." Elena didn't rise. She didn't even flinch. She simply watched the woman who had spent years trying to make her feel small. "I didn't destroy the family, Beatrice," she said, her voice sounding unnervingly calm even to her own ears. "I just stopped you from destroying Maya." "Maya is a Vance." Beatrice stepped forward, her hand slamming onto Arthur's desk. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. "She belongs to the legacy, and you've handed our private business to the wolves. For what? A few millions in a trust. I would have given you the money if you just stayed in your place." Beatrice's face didn't just fall. It seemed to dissolve, the carefully applied foundation cracking over the sudden, violent tremor in her jaw. The regal mask she had worn for decades shattered, revealing a sallow, frantic stranger beneath. Her eyes, usually sharp and calculating, went glassy and unfocused, darting around the room as if searching for a lie large enough to save her. A deep, mottled crimson crept up her neck, clashing horribly with her designer pearls, while her mouth hung open in a silent, jagged O of pure, unadulterated shock. It was the look of a woman who had finally looked into the abyss and realized it was her own reflection staring back. "It's over, Beatrice," Arthur said, sliding a single sheet of paper across the desk. "This is a formal notice of your removal from the board of directors. Effective 10 minutes ago, your access to all Vance Foundation accounts has been frozen. That includes the personal stipend you've been using to cover Cashin's gambling debts." Beatrice lunged for the paper, her fingers clawing at the edge of the desk. "You can't do this. My husband built that foundation. It's mine." "Actually," Julian spoke up from the doorway, his voice heavy with a bitterness that seemed to age him a decade. "It belonged to the children of the Vance line, all of them, not just the ones you favored. I've seen the ledgers, Mother. I've seen how much you took to keep Cashin out of prison." The silence that followed was suffocating. Beatrice turned to her son, her eyes wide with a betrayal she had never expected. She looked at Julian, then back at Elena, her chest heaving as she realized the circle had closed. The witnesses were no longer socialites with fans, they were the very people she had assumed she owned. "You'll have nothing," Beatrice hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper as she turned back to Elena. "I'll fight this. I'll hire every lawyer in the state. I'll make sure you never see a dime, and I'll take that girl so far away you'll forget what her face looks like." Elena stood up then, her movements slow and deliberate. She reached into her clutch and pulled out her phone, the screen still glowing with the active recording of the gala's final moments, and something else, a live feed from a security camera. "The locks on the estate were changed 20 minutes ago, Beatrice," Elena said, her voice as cold as the rain hitting the window. "Your personal items are being packed as we speak. They'll be delivered to a hotel of your choice. But if you ever mention my daughter's name again, or if you even think about approaching her, I won't just take the foundation. I'll release the recordings of how you talked to her when you thought no one was listening." Elena picked up her coat, the heavy wool feeling like armor. She walked toward the door, pausing only when she was inches from the woman who had once been her greatest fear. "You spent 30 years protecting a name," Elena whispered, loud enough only for Beatrice to hear. "I spent 30 minutes proving you're the only one who tarnished it." She stepped past the trembling woman and out into the hallway. She didn't look back as the elevator doors slid shut, leaving the muffled sounds of Beatrice's first true breakdown behind her. As the elevator descended, Elena felt the weight of the Vance name finally fall away, replaced by the only thing that had ever mattered. She was going home to her daughter, and for the first time in her life, the doors stayed open. 6 months had passed since the glass-walled boardroom of the Vance Foundation had shattered into 1,000 legal fragments. The dust hadn't just settled. It had been swept away, replaced by the sterile, hopeful scent of eucalyptus and high-grade antiseptic. Elena Vance stood in the center of the newly inaugurated pediatric surgical wing, her name, just hers, without the weight of a dynasty, etched into the silver plaque beside the doors. Arthur Sterling stood beside her, his tailored suit the only remnant of the old world they had dismantled together. He handed her a leather-bound folder, his expression uncharacteristically soft. "The final audit is complete, Elena. The offshore accounts Cashin used to fuel his gambling have been liquidated to fund the endowment. He's officially entered the facility in Vermont. It's high security, no access to family funds." Elena ran a thumb over the cool metal of the plaque. "And Beatrice?" "She moved into the apartment in the Heights last Tuesday," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave. "It's a 2-bedroom rental, clean but modest. The social club revoked her membership after the fraud charges were publicized. From what I hear, she spends most of her time writing letters to editors of magazines that no longer take her calls." The thought of her former mother-in-law in a cramped kitchen, surrounded by the ghosts of her own arrogance, should have felt like a victory. Instead, it felt like a closing door. Elena remembered the smell of Beatrice's cloying, expensive jasmine perfume, a scent that used to signal a coming storm. Now, that power was gone, replaced by the silence of a woman who had traded her soul for a reputation she ended up destroying herself. The mediation meeting for the sale of the Vance estate took place an hour later in a cramped, windowless office downtown. It was a far cry from the marble halls where Beatrice Vance had once reigned. When the door opened, the woman who stepped inside looked like a faded photograph of the Titan Elena had once feared. Beatrice's hair, once perfectly coiffed by a stylist who charged $500 a session, was thinning and dull. She wore a beige coat that was slightly frayed at the cuffs, and her hands, devoid of the 10-carat diamond that had been her shield, shook as she reached for a chair. "You look tired, Elena," Beatrice said, her voice still trying to find that old, jagged edge of condescension. "I suppose running a hospital on stolen family money takes its toll." The audacity of the comment hit Elena like a physical weight. Even now, stripped of her wealth and standing, the woman refused to see the truth. "The money wasn't stolen from the family, Beatrice. It was reclaimed for the people you took it from. There's a difference." "You've ruined us," Beatrice hissed, her eyes darting to Arthur and then back to Elena. The skin around her jaw hung loose, the lack of expensive treatments revealing the bitterness that had always lived beneath the surface. The Vance name is a joke in this city because of your theatrics. You've left your own daughter with nothing but a scandal. I've left my daughter with a mother who isn't a criminal, Elena replied, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy calm. She slid a single document across the table, the final settlement. I didn't have to leave you the stipend, Beatrice. The board wanted to strip you of everything. I'm the one who ensured you had a roof over your head. Not because you deserve it, but because Maya shouldn't have to grow up knowing her grandmother died in a shelter. Beatrice looked down at the paper, her mouth working but no sound coming out. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, cheap ticking of a plastic clock on the wall. For a moment, the mask slipped, and Elena saw the sheer, hollow terror in the older woman's eyes. She was alone, unloved, and finally, completely irrelevant. Elena stood up, the movement fluid and certain. She didn't wait for a thank you that would never come. She walked out of the office, the sound of her own steady footsteps on the linoleum floors sounding like a drumbeat of freedom. Later that evening, Elena sat on the porch of her new home, a small, sun-drenched house near the coast. Maya was in the yard, her laughter echoing as she chased a golden retriever through the tall grass. The girl looked lighter, the shadows that had haunted her eyes during the years of Beatrice's lessons finally gone. Arthur had been right, the victory was absolute. But as Elena watched her daughter, she felt the sharp, lingering sting of the cost. She had saved Maya, but she had also had to show her the darkness of her own bloodline. She had traded the illusion of a grand family for the harsh, lonely reality of the truth. She picked up a glass of water, the condensation cold against her palm. She was no longer a Vance by marriage, but a woman who had survived one. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the lawn. Elena took a breath, the air tasting of salt and cedar, and for the first time in a decade, she didn't look over her shoulder. The doors were open, the debt was paid, and the silence was finally her own.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.